When we hear the word atrocity, right, we usually picture this spontaneous explosion of chaos, just an unpredictable unraveling of society. But looking at the historical records, they actually tell a totally different and honestly much more terrifying story. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're essentially stepping into a historical crime scene to investigate the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And our goal isn't just to talk about what happened, we really want to examine the structural blueprints of how it happened. We're going to break down the meticulous engineering, the bureaucratic planning, and the specific artifacts that prove this was absolutely not some spontaneous tragedy, but a highly calculated operation. To really grasp the level of foresight involved here, listen to this chilling sign-off. Where there is a will, there is a way. Let's go. Those words were written by United Nations Commander General Romeo Dallaire on January 11, 1994. He sent this in an urgent fax to his superiors in New York. And the absolute craziest part? This warning was sent almost 3 full months before the slaughter even began. The clock was ticking, the alarm was blaring, and yet the world basically just stood still.
Let's look at Exhibit A, Engineering the Divide.
To truly understand this divide, we actually have to rewind way past the violence of 1994, all the way back to the bureaucratic offices of the 1930s. It is wild how a simple piece of paper can basically become a weapon. Following World War I, Belgium took over colonial control of Rwanda, and to consolidate their power, these European administrators relied on these totally pseudoscientific racial theories. During a census between 1933 and 1934, they mandated that every single Rwandan carry a national identity card, permanently stamping them with an ethnic label: Hutu, Tutsi, Twa, or naturalized. Now before this, these categories were pretty fluid, often just based on wealth or how many cattle you owned. But this colonial paperwork completely crystallized those boundaries into rigid, inescapable racial castes. It essentially elevated the Tutsi minority and disenfranchised the Hutu majority.
And you can track this lethal trajectory perfectly across the decades. The ID cards introduced in the 30s bred deep, deep resentment, which culminated in the 1959 Hutu Revolution, where the Tutsi monarchy was totally overthrown. Fast forward to the 1990s, when a rebel group of Tutsi exiles called the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, invades. The Hutu-led government immediately uses this as a pretext to label all Tutsi citizens as enemy accomplices. So when the genocide was ultimately unleashed in 1994, those exact same colonial ID cards were used at checkpoints all across the country to identify and execute Tutsis right on the spot.
Moving on to Exhibit B, the warning ignored. Okay, so if the foundation was laid in the 30s, the final alarm was definitely tripped in early 1994. Remember that January 11th fax from General Dallaire? Well, it wasn't based on some rumor. He got inside intelligence from a high-level informant known as Jean-Pierre. This guy was actually a trainer for the Interahamwe, which was the extremist Hutu youth militia. Jean-Pierre flat-out told Dallaire that weapons were being stockpiled and that he'd been ordered to register all Tutsis in the capital city of Kigali. And the math here is just chilling. Jean-Pierre boasted that his guys were being trained to kill up to 1,000 Tutsis every 20 minutes.
Dallaire desperately begged the UN for permission to raid these weapons caches and protect his informant, which brings us to an absolutely crucial question. Why did the United Nations flat-out refuse to act? Well, the answer comes down to recent geopolitics. Just a few months prior, in 1993, 18 American Rangers were killed in Somalia during a military operation. So, totally paralyzed by the shadow of Somalia and terrified of mission creep, UN officials in New York just denied Dallaire's request. Instead, they actually instructed him to share his intelligence with the very government officials who were tied to the militias.
Exhibit C, Broadcasting Hate.
With the international community effectively neutralizing itself, the extremists shifted their focus straight to the public. I mean, how do you actually socialize an entire population to literally murder their neighbors? You weaponize the airwaves. A new radio station called RTLM, founded by Hutu extremists, used this highly specific 3-part tactic. And they didn't start with violence. They started with entertainment. The lure was pop music, crude jokes, and these cool, relatable DJs that were totally different from the stuffy official state radio. But once they had the audience hooked, the propaganda kicked in. They relentlessly dehumanized the Tutsi population, calling them Inyenzi, or cockroaches, and warning that Tutsis were this existential threat that had to be wiped out. Finally, once the killing actually started, the station shifted to pure coordination. They became known as Radio Machete, and they literally broadcast the exact street addresses and license plate numbers of targeted individuals straight to the roaming militias.
On the night of April 6, 1994, the plane carrying Rwanda's president Habyarimana was shot down. Within hours, RTLM broadcasters were on the airwaves using coded but crystal clear language. They told their listeners to go to work and to clear the brush. The trap had been sprung.
Exhibit D. The world walks away.
As the violence erupted, the extremists made a super calculated gamble. They bet that the international community would basically just pack up and run. And their strategy was brutal, but it worked. On April 7th, literally day one of the genocide, the Presidential Guard murdered moderate Hutu Prime Minister Agathe Uwilingiyimana, along with 10 Belgian UN peacekeepers who were assigned to protect her. Look, this was no accident. The extremists knew for a fact that killing Western troops would trigger a massive domestic political crisis back in the West, and they won that bet. Belgium swiftly yanked its entire contingent right out of the UN mission. Meanwhile, over in the US, the government was actively instructing its officials to completely avoid using the word genocide. Why? Because acknowledging it meant they were legally obligated to intervene under the 1948 Genocide Convention. Which brings us to this absolutely staggering number, 250. On April 21st, 2 weeks into this horrific slaughter, while tens of thousands of people are being hacked to death every single day, the UN Security Council holds a vote. And instead of sending reinforcements, they vote to slash the UN peacekeeping force in Rwanda from 2,500 troops down to a completely powerless skeleton crew of just 250. The world quite literally walked away.
Exhibit E. 43 days.
It is so easy to get lost in the geopolitics and the troop numbers, but we really have to ground ourselves in the visceral reality of what was happening on the ground. On April 15th, a 12-year-old Tutsi girl named Valentina Iribagiza, along with her family and over 5,000 other people, sought refuge at the Narabuye Catholic Church. Now, historically, churches were supposed to be safe havens in Rwanda, but the rules had totally changed. The local governor himself led the Interahamwe militia straight to the church, telling them to make sure no one survived.
Valentina's testimony of what happened next is just harrowing. The militia attacked with machetes and grenades. Valentina's fingers were chopped off, and she suffered a deep cut to her head. But she survived the initial slaughter by hiding under the bodies of the dead, just covered in their blood. Late in the night, the militia came back to check for survivors. A militiaman literally stepped on Valentina's head, shook her a bit with his foot, and casually declared to the others, "This thing is dead." And for the next 43 days, a 12-year-old girl lived entirely alone among the rotting corpses of her family and her neighbors. She hid in a tiny room and threw rocks to fend off the wild dogs that would come in the night to scavenge the remains. She survived against absolutely impossible odds, but those scars, both physical and mental, they are permanent.
Valentina's story is really just a microcosm of a much larger, frankly incomprehensible tragedy. In just 100 days, between 800,000 and 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were murdered. The speed and the efficiency of this slaughter were totally unprecedented. But, as we've seen today, this wasn't some sudden burst of madness. It was the direct result of identity cards issued decades prior, hate radio socializing the masses, weapons caches built up in plain sight, and an international community that was warned over and over again, but ultimately chose diplomatic comfort over moral courage.
Which leaves us with a really heavy but absolutely necessary thought. What you should take away from this isn't just the history of a tragedy back in 1994, but the actual mechanics of how hate is weaponized. We have the memos, we have the transcripts, we have the identity cards. If the blueprints of a modern atrocity are so clearly visible in the artifacts of history, why do we, as a global community, still struggle to recognize them before it's too late? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.